Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Crypt Finder. Long before Jaws or Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a very young Steven Spielberg was just getting his start, really cutting his teeth as far as directing some television. And one of the more fascinating things that he directed was a made-for-TV horror movie called Something Evil. This actually debuted on CBS January 21st, 1972. It's often overshadowed by his much more well-known and beloved made-for-TV movie Duel from 1971, but this very atmospheric supernatural story, you can see Spielberg really starting to hone in on building mood and tension and some very creative camera angles to tell this story, and of course that would all become hallmarks of his later films. The film stars Sandy Dennis as Marjorie Warden. She's a very sensitive artist who moves with her husband, Paul, who's played by Darren McGavin. Of course, you would know him from The Night Stalker, the sequel The Night Strangler, and the series Kolchak, The Night Stalker fame. But they move with their children to an old Pennsylvania farmhouse. They're chasing a simpler, more peaceful life in the country, but Marjorie soon begins to sense something's not quite right. It seems like something unseen is lurking around the property. It's tied to the barn. It's tied to these strange jars of red liquid. There's just this chilling presence that seems to be targeting her and her family. At its surface, Something Evil is a domestic ghost story, but just beneath that, there's a lot of emotional vulnerability and maternal fears. Spielberg takes the familiar ingredients of early 70s TV horror. You've got things like the rural isolation, the unseen forces, the skeptical husband. In fact, if you take a look back at another video that I did from 1970s Crowhaven Farm, yep, exact same tropes that are there. But here, Spielberg infuses them with sort of a convincing realism. Rather than relying on any flashy effects, which they would have never had the budget to experiment with anyway, instead the film builds its terror through sound and wind and shadows and the suggestion that the house itself has kind of turned against the occupants. Something Evil is pretty interesting as far as supernatural television. We don't really ever know what these ghosts or demons want, and I'm okay with that. I'm fine not knowing necessarily, but that was very unusual for made-for-TV movies, especially from the early 70s, where typically there was the idea you had to explain why things were happening the way that they were. We have an intro where someone dies, but we don't know for what end. There are moments in the movie you're not sure who's the target of these manifestations, and again, for what purpose. William Peter Blatty's novel The Exorcist, it was published in 1971. The film came out in 1973. So this film would not have been unfamiliar with the success of the novel, and then of course that Warner Brothers was turning it into a film. So this could have been a made-for-TV movie trying to capitalize on the novel's immense popularity, and subsequently what they assumed would be a big hit, because much like The Exorcist, there aren't any clear-cut reasons like why the demon Pazuzu picks Regan McNeil as its victim either. And as I said, I'm totally fine with just the idea that there is something evil preying on this particular family in this particular location and not having or needing any verification of what it actually wants or the excesses or limits of its power. But this movie is also a window into Spielberg's developing style, even at this early stage. His instinct for storytelling, it's just remarkable. The camera lingers just long enough on a half-open door or an empty room to let the viewer's imagination start to do a lot of the work. You can already see the craftsmanship on display here that would be a big focus in a lot of his future films. You've got the focus on the family dynamics. You've got a collision of wonder and terror and just ordinary people that are suddenly thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Even the way his camera sort of moves through crowded rooms with a lot of partygoers and picks up little bits of disjointed conversation, it's so nice. And I've never noticed it before, but Carl Gottlieb he's actually in a couple of scenes as an unnamed party guest. Gottlieb was friends with Spielberg, and of course he famously co-wrote the screenplay to Jaws and was in the film as well. He plays Harry Meadows, the newspaper editor on Amity Island. Performances are key to the film's tension here. Sandy Dennis brings up fragile, almost raw intensity to Marjorie, grounding the supernatural events in a deeply human kind of anxiety. Sandy Dennis was always a performer who could just tap into that fragile, wounded persona. I think the best example of her doing that is her fantastic turn in Robert Altman's film version of the play, Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, which came out in 1982. She perfectly captures the character of Mona in that breathy, nervous, wistful kind of way that she had of delivering a line. Darren McGavin, who's always commanding, perfectly embodies that sort of pragmatic husband and father who's caught between concern and disbelief. The relationship between husband and wife really helps anchor the film, making the haunting feel a lot more personal than just purely fantastical. Of course, part of the standard trope was having him as the stoic man, not believing any of the supernatural ramblings from his wife until, there's no denying it any longer, and he finally has to face that threat head on. Ralph Bellamy also has a small role as a neighbor who believes something is, off, and Bellamy will be remembered for a huge body of work, of course, but for horror fans, he was in the original 1941's The Wolfman. He also was in The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942 and very memorable in Rosemary's Baby in 1968. Johnny Whitaker plays the warden's son Stevie, and he was a gifted child actor. He starred in TV's Family Affair and just a slew of Disney films like Napoleon and Samantha, also co-starring Jodie Foster in 1972, The Biscuit Eater, and Snowball Express. Both of those films came out in 1972, and he was in 1973's Tom Sawyer. He also starred in the Sid and Marty Krofft Saturday morning show Sigmund and the Sea Monsters in 1973 through 1974. I remember it well. Jeff Corey and John Rubinstein also co-star. Rubinstein's character here, he's named Ernest. So Ralph Bellamy's character, Harry Lincoln, is his uncle. And there's something sort of odd about Rubinstein's performance here. Maybe there were remnants of something from earlier script rewrites. Maybe it's just the way Rubinstein plays the character. It just feels a little bit off. Now, please don't get me wrong. John Rubinstein is a terrific actor. I actually saw him in a Broadway production of M. Butterfly back in the 80s. He and B.D. Wong, both absolutely fantastic. And John Rubinstein has also done a little bit of horror here and there. You might remember him from 1977's The Car, and we'll call it horror adjacent, The Boys from Brazil in 1978. Perhaps he was just a red herring, and the audience is supposed to think he has something more to do with the hauntings around the farm, but all his interactions play somewhat menacing. If you've seen the film, let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. There's just something unusual about his performance, and he seems slightly threatening at times, even though ultimately the character is not. So not really completely sure where they were going there. Visually here, Spielberg's playing with a lot of natural light and reflections and off-kilter framing just to kind of keep viewers uneasy. The Pennsylvania countryside, which it's clearly not shot in Pennsylvania, it's somewhere in the California area, of course. But yeah, we'll go with the Pennsylvania idea here. It's actually kind of nice. You've got this sort of foreboding pastoral setting concealing something very malignant, and it's that tension between the comfort and the menace that I think gives something evil that lasting little bite. While it never achieved the cult status of Duel, still, this is an overlooked little flick of the 1970s, a little piece of television horror. I would say a quiet precursor to some of the domestic hauntings that would ultimately just dominate the genre later on. You can think of course, The Exorcist, the Amityville Horror, and even Poltergeist, which Spielberg co-wrote and produced. I'm not sure why Spielberg never just went full force and actually made a horror film or a supernatural film. I do consider Jaws a horror movie. I know there's a little bit of a debate there. Sometimes people think it's more action, it's more thriller. I consider it a horror film, and I think that there are some horror elements in The War of the Worlds. And then, of course, there's a lot of speculation out there on the web about how much co-directing Spielberg actually did with Poltergeist in 1982. But I would have loved for him, and still would love for him, to actually tackle a very serious horror film. I think for horror fans and film historians alike, it's a pretty fascinating look at Spielberg learning to scare not so much with monsters, but with mood, and proving that the most unsettling horrors often really just begin at home. So I think that will do it for us right now, everybody. If you've seen something evil, please comment down below. Let me know what you think about this movie. Have a little bit of an odd relationship with this film. I saw it in 1972. Didn't really do that much for me. Then probably maybe 20 years ago, I watched it again. It was all right. I felt sort of the same way, like it was a little bit lackluster. But then I decided, let me give it another shot. And because I was considering another made-for-TV movie, and I thought, it's been a long time. I watched it, really, really enjoyed it. So maybe it's just whatever is going on in your life at that particular moment, but I do think it has way more strengths than flaws. So go give it a watch if you haven't seen it. It's available on YouTube, so you can go and watch the movie right now. Until next time, everybody, stay curious and stay scared.